Earlier this year, the World Cup winning US women's soccer team filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against the United States Soccer Federation. The athletes were not just taking issue with the size of their paychecks, but also with where they play, how they travel to matches, medical treatment, and coaching they receive in what they termed as institutionalized gender discrimination. Our next session for the day is a panel discussion on towards equal pay for equal play. The panel will discuss the issues and challenges in making a case for equal pay and structural solutions that could possibly be implemented. Our panelists today are Ms. Anna Kessel, Women's Sport Editor at the Telegraph UK and author of Eat, Sweat, Play: How Sport Can Change Our Lives. She also co-founded Women in Football, an organization lobbying against sexism in the game and championing female role models. Ms. Jayna Kothari, Senior Advocate and co-founder and Executive Director, Center for Law and Policy Research. Ms. Kathryn Gill, former player for the Australian Women's National Soccer Team, Deputy Chief Executive, Professional Footballers Australia. She played a key role in the passing of the collective bargaining agreement between Football Federation Australia and Professional Footballers Australia that reduced the pay gap between the Socceroos and the Matildas. Ms. Sharda Ugra, Senior Editor, ESPN India. Ms. Snehal Pradhan, former Indian cricketer and sports journalist. And the moderator of the session, Ms. Karunya Keshav, reporter and senior editor at Wisden India Almanac and co-author of The Fire Burns Blue, A History of Women's Cricket in India. If you do have any questions during the session, please do type them in to the Q&A box below, and our panelists will try to answer some of them. Over to Karunya and the panelists.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we've spent today talking about how the last few years have been transformational for women's sport, not just because we're seeing more women play mainstream sports on TV and our devices, but also because there's some really important conversations that have been happening about just what is right, and those voices have just got louder. There was this incredible moment in last year's FIFA Women's World Cup after the US women's national team won their 4th title, when the whole stadium in France broke out in chants of equal pay. Back in the 1970s, Billie Jean King was, of course, a pioneer for talk about equal pay with her Battle of the Sexes, and thanks in large part to the activism she started, the tennis Grand Slams now offer equality to both men and women spinners. But there's still a long way to go, and this idea of equal pay for equal play has got new legs thanks to the US women's national team's lawsuit against the National Federation, which Sean just mentioned. It's shown us that the conversation about equal pay can't just be about the final check that the athlete gets, but also about institutional equality and how we develop this ecosystem that is equal. Just to talk a little bit about the case, the US women's national team, when they won the World Cup last year, when the men's team didn't even qualify for the 2018 edition. The women are 4-time winners, and the men only made it to the round of 16 in 2015. the women play more games, they get better TV ratings and account for higher revenues. Their jersey is the best-selling soccer jersey, men or women, on Nike.com in that season. Yet the players have argued in their lawsuit that they earn less than the men. Now, 28 players were part of this lawsuit, and it accuses the Federation of institutionalized gender discrimination towards the team. They say that this discrimination has caused or contributed to and perpetuated gender-based pay disparities against the players in nearly every aspect of their employment. So this includes payments, bonuses, marketing budgets, accommodation, travel. So just according to the lawsuit, if a top women's player earns only about 38% of what the man makes on average, with a gap of that's over $160,000, and where the men got around 5 million in bonuses after being eliminated in the round of 16, the women got about just 1.7 million after winning the whole thing in 2015. So in response, the Federation tried to show that the women were in fact not doing equal work, that they're not doing the work that's of equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and these two things simply cannot be compared under the Equal Pay Act, and that the men needed special charter planes to travel. Now, needless to say, this didn't go down very well. Now, the case is ongoing, and there have been some setbacks for the women in this, but there have been some successful efforts towards equality. The Australia women's soccer team called the Matildas reached a landmark deal with their federation in 2019, and this collective bargaining agreement reduced the pay gap and ensured that Matildas would be paid just as much as the Socceroos, which is what the men's team is called. And it assured them of equitable conditions of employment. We have with us Kathryn, so I'd probably like to start with her, who was part of this getting this historic deal in place. Kathryn, coming to you, can you give us a background of how this CBA was put into place, and why did the players finally say that what, enough is enough, and what does it mean for them to have this in place?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to come in on that conversation, and it's great to be on. So thank you for inviting me and involving me. To paint a bit of a picture as to how we got to where we got to, it was definitely a journey. It started well before I was wearing the green and gold. So back when the Matildas first started in 1975, and they'd just come such a long way, but starting from a base where it was just that sense of gratitude that you feel, especially as a woman and a female in such a male-heavy sport, but sport in general, it always just seems to be like you should be grateful for being a part of that. And I know as when I was young and when I was playing, I never really cottoned on to the fact that we were doing exactly what our male counterparts were doing and receiving far less in terms of resources, in terms of remuneration, in terms of respect, in terms of commerciality, in terms of marketability. And it wasn't until I got involved with the Players Association here in Australia, the current organisation that I work for, that we understood the power of being a collective voice and being united and all working together and fighting for the same cause. And it was through that organisation where we were able to collectively bargain, we were able to organise, we were able to mobilise, we got behind what we needed to change. And that kind of started us on that journey to be able to reach a crescendo in 2015, where we were actually set to go off and play the US world champions. You live and you breathe for these moments, but we decided that the Federation wasn't meeting us halfway. They weren't willing to talk to us about our new collective deal. So we went on strike, effectively. We didn't get on a plane. And there was a lot of chaos around this, but from that chaos, this is what created this change. And we were empowered, we understood, we took a massive step. It was pretty bold and decisive for us to actually turn around and say, no, we're not going to play. We're not going to play until you start talking to us, you start respecting us, you start dignifying our careers as female footballers. And from there, I stepped out of the national team and then became more involved with the Players Association, and we then transitioned this into the domestic league. So we started with our W League. We collectively organised them. We started slow. We had basic incremental steps, and from then we looked after them. And then this kind of spitballed, and we came to a point where we were like, we can do this collective deal for the Matildas. And it was very principled. And I'm just taking you on the journey that we went on, but we basically structured it through 3 key principles. that there's a partnership, which is all about the players being partnered with the game, but also with the federations. And this was with the one brand, one team. So the Matildas and the Socceroos, they came together. Then we looked at gender equality and how we were going to remunerate. But it wasn't just about the financial reward. It was the performance standards that sat behind that, the respect, the commercialization, the branding. And then it was about leadership, is how we invest and we give back to grassroots. So those three key principles drove the deal, which then landed in a model where we could equitably be rewarded also, but be rewarded for everyone. So it was just fantastic for us to get to that point.
There's this quote, I think that's attributed to Billie Jean King again, where she says that everyone thinks women should be thrilled when we get crumbs, but I want women to have the cake, the icing, and the cherry on the top. And it sounds like this is what something like the CBA does. Now, we saw in the case of the US women's national team that the federation claimed that the work done was just in fact not equal. And this is an argument that comes up a lot when we talk about equal pay, saying, you know, the women don't get as much, bring as much revenues in. So Jayna, if I can come to you, how do you make a case for equal pay in terms of, you know, the economics, in terms of rights, in terms of labor law?
Thanks, Karunya, and thanks for having me part of this panel. Yeah, so, you know, when we talk of equal pay for equal play, it's rooted in the, you know, basic principles of equality and non-discrimination. And, you know, while we have it in our constitution, you know, it is a constitutional right to equality, you know, there are also equal remuneration laws. So, you know, I mean, I'll just talk about India, and, you know, we have the Equal Remuneration Act, which talks about equal pay for men and women doing the same kind of work. The question here in sports, I mean, you know, you spoke about the US case where there have been collective bargaining agreements, or in other countries as well, where players and teams get together and make these agreements. But in the Indian context, the scenario is a little different. And when we talk about equal pay at work in the sports field, the question really is that is sport, you know, is playing sport professionally, is that considered as work? And the payment that athletes receive, can you say that these are wages, or this is payment for work? Are they engaged in work? Are they employed by their teams or the federations or the sporting organizations? And I think that the question in India hasn't come up, but whenever questions of equal pay for equal work for sport has come up, that this is one aspect. And you know, I want to also talk about a UK case of a very well-known athlete, Jess Varnish. I was just reading about it, where she took up the case where women cyclists were paid much lesser on the professional circuit. She went to the UK Employment Tribunal, lost there because the Employment Tribunal held that what the federation, the cycling federation, was doing is not paying her wages, but just supporting her professionally, supporting her sport. And she's gone in appeal. So, you know, so the labor law standards of equal pay for equal work, we need the law to recognize that professional sporting work is work. It's a work where their remuneration should be treated as work remuneration, as wages, and all compensation should be treated as such, where you can impose equality obligations, that there should be no discrimination. So, you know, in India, that kind of clarity is not there. And I think the second question, you know, you put that is the labor of women athletes, or say the economic value of their sport any lesser? And so therefore, you know, what about that? I mean, certainly, I mean, you know, in this panel, or you can ask any, you know, I don't think you can ever say that the labor value of women athletes is any less by any stretch. So I don't think you can say that at all. And economic value of sport, you know, women's sports, you know, I think that's always made out to be the case to justify, you know, unequal pay or unequal compensation. But I think there is, you know, And as people from, the rest of the people on my panel who are kind of seeped into sport will be able to tell you, and you yourself, that, all of this is also the way women's sports are marketed and promoted, right? Men's sports, well-known, male athletes are promoted in a much bigger way than women's sports are promoted. So, I mean, definitely economic returns are going to be lesser. So I think the argument, in addition to saying that there should be equal pay for women athletes, the argument should also extend to, how can we ensure that there's equality and non-discrimination in the entire work of sports, which includes promoting sports, promoting athletes, promoting the game, ensuring equal economic remuneration for the sport for both men and women's sports. So I mean, make a larger claim for equality and not just for pay.
Right. So essentially, rather than making a case for equal pay just within the umbrella of labor law, we also sort of extended to start looking at it in terms of in values, that there's almost this moral obligation to pay women more because, in context of a historical injustice and in context of all the things such as marketing that they don't get. Anna, if I can come to you on this, would you say that this is the right way to sort of structure an argument when you say, yeah, we want equal pay?
Sorry, I think it's really interesting that in the US women's national team lawsuit, they were asking for over $66 million. And part of the way that they created that sum was because they felt reparations should be paid to previous generations of US women national team players. So this wasn't just money for themselves, it was looking back and recognizing the very long history of inequality in their sport. And I think unless you have that longer view of the whole picture, you don't really know where you are today. Why are women footballers in the UK, bar at Lewis FC, where they're paid equally to their male counterparts? Why are they paid less than men? People on Twitter will tell you, oh, it's an economic model. Simple. More people watch men's football than women's. I think the US women's national team case shows very clearly that it's not just about economics. There is, institutionalized discrimination. The very fact that the women bring in more money than the men, bring in greater revenue, bring in greater audience figures, etc., and still are paid less, shows that this is not an economic decision. But how have we got here? We've got here because around the world for over a century, women have been discriminated against. We have been actively prevented from playing. In my country, in England, there was a ban on women's football from 1921 to 1971. The following 40 years, even after the ban was lifted, women's football was almost entirely neglected. And it was only in 2011 that the Women's Super League, the top tier of women's football here, was established. And at that time, it was still not established as a professional league. So, look how far behind we are from our male counterparts. And even today, looking at my two young daughters, I have an 8-year-old and a 4-year-old. The boys in my 8-year-old school, they have been playing football from the minute that they could walk. They were given provision to play it in the school, which is a very nice school. I support them fully, but without really thinking it through, they were offering boys football, but not offering girls football. It's so embedded in every single way that we look. How can we possibly think that if we go by the economic argument, if we accept the kind of cultural social model that women are going to get a fair deal? They're just not. And until we fight it, hats off to everything that the Australian women did to try and change things. Same to Norway as well, and all the people that are trying to make a difference. Until you make a decision that you're not going to accept it, and until people in positions of power make a decision that they're going to change it, things are not going to happen organically. We could wait another 200 years and we still would not be paid equal pay. And as Jayna has said so eloquently there, and I think a person on the previous panel mentioned too, this is also about equity. It's not just about money. Women have different needs to men, and unless we support women in an equitable way, we will not actually reach equality.
Sharda, if I can come to you at this point, we've been when we talk about this argument, it seems that a lot of the burden is still on the women to sort of point these things out, to point out these occasions where, as a young girl, if they they didn't really have all these chances. How do we sort of deal with that right now? Shad, I think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The women in sport deal with it by battling it as they battle through all sort of normal handicaps of whatever their ability and talent is, particularly in India, what kind of acceptance there is socially. And I think the one way that it can be countered is by questioning. So I was just listening to all the conversation. I said this is not, as Anna just pointed out, it's not just about pay. It's about equity. So you're looking at economy, you're looking at sort of the economic aspect, you're looking at governance and the entire ecosystem that exists around it in terms of marketing, commercial, opportunities that women athletes are given and so on. And fundamentally at the center of it is being able to ask the people that run sport is, what do you run sport for? Do you run it to benefit sport, or do you run it to make money? Does sport exist to make you money, or is sport here for you to make it grow? And with it, you have sort of 50% of the world's population that needs to be as invested in it as the other half has been for so long. The only way to counter it is to challenge it and to question it all the time. And we're seeing particularly now in India, with reference to a lot of Indian women athletes that are there, that are successful, and therefore they are paid attention. But at the same time, you're seeing it, as Snehal will also go on to tell us, in women's cricket as to how it's going to work, because that is the frontline sport in terms of marketability and funding and so on. And it is a sport that doesn't need the money that it makes is fine, but it'll survive very well with the revenue that it makes per se. They don't need the women cricketers to make money on their behalf. They can do it pretty much by themselves.
It's interesting to hear Sharda say that female cricketers in India BCCI doesn't need female cricketers to make money themselves. They need to make it on their behalf. But if Snehal can come in here, we've heard some cricketers say that until we get we can match these revenues, until we can match the same ticket revenues that as the men get, then we can't really be in a position to really ask for these things. How have you found this as a sports person in your conversations? Like, how exactly do you sort of empower female sports persons to have these conversations with people in positions of authority? Maybe dare we say in a sort of patriarchal society that we may, and how can they sort of overcome those and say, yeah, as a child that I did have these problems, and yeah, we do need to talk about it.
It's hard, and you'll see very few active women cricketers talk about it. I remember a conversation that you and I, Karunya, had in 2015 when I was still playing, and some people at Wisden India were having a conversation with me as a member of the national team to maybe make a representation from the players to the BCCI to implement contracts for women. And at the time, 2015, India was the only country in the top 8 nations of the world who had still not contracted our female cricketers. And I went and had a chat with one of the senior most women's cricketers in India. And this is, a person who is probably the most secure kind of person in the team regarding her own place. So when I had a chat with her about it, do you think we should do this? And we were just preparing for a series against New Zealand. She said, let's see how the series goes. And if we win, we'll talk about it. So there is still within the Indian sports, probably beyond cricket also, other sports, this feeling that you need to prove yourself to be able to ask for the most basic things. Everyone talks about, women having to show they are twice as good to just get half of what the men get. And this is true. There is this attitude of kis muh se pooche, which we say in Hindi, and what face can we show, or we have to win something first and then you can ask for improvement, investment in sport. And this has always been the case, is my experience as a player. And only once I transition from a person, from a player to a person in the media, do I have a voice which I can make myself heard. Because unlike in Australia, there is no strong players association for India to make these kind of voices heard safely. An example from the book that you guys have written, Karunya, is that in 1984, I think Shanta Rangaswamy was campaigning for better pay because the Indian women's team were getting a lot of people into stadiums and good gate receipts, but they were not being paid well. And because of that campaign, they wore black armbands for a test series. And the next series, she was dropped. And that's the kind of fear under which Indian sports ecosystem operates, that for women it's not easy to make their voices heard, and therefore it is almost a responsibility for the media, for people like me, Sharda, Anna, to present that case.
And Kathryn, do you have a response to this? Is this something you've faced as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with Snehal there. She's saying exactly what my lived experience has been as well. And we're just fortunate enough that we have a strong players union, which allowed us to have a collective voice and to organize ourselves and begin to respect ourselves. And that was the catalyst for change once we were able to kind of understand. But it's so institutionalized, it's so hard. Like even through COVID, when you're thinking at the moment, and it makes me laugh, like we have all these male presidents leading countries, and you think about if a female was doing it, what kind of essential services we would need. Like it would be totally different to what's already happening. So the systemic kind of, the systems that already exist, you've just really got to break them down. And they're so male centric. Like even for females, it's like dumping the women's framework straight into the men's. There's no kind of feeling around how women should interact with sport or how that works, even from like a physical standpoint, a medical standpoint. All the research is backed for men. So it's really, really hard, but you've got to take chances and you've got to be bold. And that's what we had to do to bring about change. So completely empathize with that situation.
It's interesting that you mentioned the whole physical aspect of it, the fact that there's a completely different framework that's required. In December 2018, the World Tennis Association announced that a set of new rules that would no longer penalize women for taking leaves of absence due to pregnancy. And I think the CBA that Australia have, the deal that the Australian women's cricket team also has, does acknowledge what will happen if a player gets pregnant. Anna, if I can come to you, can you give us a little idea about how important it is to address these within the argument of equal pay as well, because they're an important aspect of it?
Absolutely. And I think that's why that word equity is so important. We're not just asking for a financial, we're not just asking for a number, we're asking for a different model that actually works for women in the way that Kathryn's just explained there. You know, we can't just take what exists in men's football or men's sport and think that it's going to work for women. For example, the Women's Super League, which is the top football league here, and we recently ran a story. I was stunned to find this out, that in the contracts for the players, bear in mind, this is meant to be the best football league, women's football league in the world. There is no maternity provision for women footballers in those contracts. So it's at the discretion of the club, or they can have the option to use a sort of employee-wide policy that, you know, the administrator or the chef or the finance director might have. But those things are not applicable to female athletes who have different challenges. They're physically using their bodies and need different provision. At the very basic level, most clubs were just providing what we call statutory maternity pay, which is not enough to live off, by the way. It's just extraordinary that was not thought of, you know, in a league that was set to revolutionize sport here and has in so many ways, that motherhood was just simply forgotten about. And no surprise then that FIFPro, the Global Football Players Union, found that I think less than 1% of female footballers around the world are mothers. Right? No surprise, because they're not catered for, they're not supported, and working mothers have it hard enough out there beyond sport in the working world. You know, we've seen during this COVID crisis, certainly in the UK, mothers are twice as likely or 50% more likely to lose their jobs than fathers. So mothers are very much at risk anyway. But even you know, some leagues have had great success in supporting mothers. In Australia, for example, the Netball League there. In America, the women's NBA have put in place amazing policies that supports even fertility and being able to have this option of freezing your eggs and so on. And that's because of people like Megan Rapinoe and Sue Bird, and the really important conversations that they've had looking at the much wider picture of all women. When we say women, we mustn't think of this sort of homogeneous group of white, usually white, privileged global north women who fit a certain mold. We must think of all women and the variety and complexity of those different needs.
Sharda, so you're nodding to that. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole question of the fact that sport is built around what it is, what it does, what it takes from, what it gives to men, you know, as a whole. There's very recently, I came across a study done at the Inspire Institute of Sport in Bellary, about 6-7 hours from Bangalore, which is looking at it's almost for the first time as to the impact that menstruation has on the iron levels of athletes or female athletes, what it does to them, how these must be compensated against, so that they, particularly in combat sports, that they're able to compensate for it in combat sports. And the scientists that are there behind it, they are astonished that nothing like this has happened. They haven't seen studies like this anywhere else in the world, you know. And this is taking place here. You're just checking. They're just checking athletes' iron levels, women athletes, combat athletes' iron levels during menstruation, which is just the most natural thing that every single female athlete will go through. But these conversations don't happen because you are all of us. I mean, I'm included in it. We are just looking at sport from a completely male-centric point of view. And coming to the topic of the Indian women cricketers. It's, you know, for us to be listening, for Snehal, me, you, Jayna a little bit also, to be listening to the fact that there are player associations and there is collective bargaining. I mean, the men here don't collectively bargain, never mind the women. The male cricketers don't collectively bargain here. You know, so when the women are going to get to that, we don't know. And there are still no contracts for our women cricketers, as you know, even at the domestic level. So they're literally functioning on basically very rudimentary match allowances. And this is 2020, you know.
Yeah. So
can I just jump in there?
Yeah, go for it.
I totally agree with you, and I think the other interesting one is from the governance structures as well, and the women that are involved and embedded through those processes. Because I don't just think it's women on the context in the field in sport. It's also those that sit in leadership and administration roles, and they're few and far between. So these decisions are being made by men on the behalf of women who have no understanding or lived experience what it's like to be a female operating at that level. So I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think it comes down to the structures as well, and those people in the positions of power and influence that are making the decisions on behalf of us.
So we've talked a lot about these various aspects of equality and equity that we need to look at now, and we've also spoken about how something like COVID can completely throw everything off track. In a situation where there is limited funding, how is the need to give a woman player an equitable contract? How do you balance it with other practicalities such as building facilities, funding the grassroots? I know Snehal has written about this a fair bit, in which he says that, it's maybe okay that even though Virat Kohli has gets a contract of 7 crore and the women's team T20 captain gets a contract of 50 lakh, that's okay. Or at least we need to be talking about something else before we start talking about that.
Yeah, that's a position that I've written about before. The top paying Indian female as a cricketer gets less, probably 50% less than the bottom paying male cricketer. I think male contracts start at 1 crore, female contracts start or top off at 50 lakhs. But if you look at it realistically, 50 lakhs is a decent amount of money. And someone who's making 50 lakhs, I'm not worried about them. I'm more worried about the girls at the grassroots cricket who are making barely enough to cover the cost of their equipment. I mean, we're lucky. Some countries don't have any kind of payment for their state level cricket. I'm looking at investments that need to go into the grassroots and into the structures which will help women's cricket create more of these stars, because finally, where is the money going to come from in India? India is driven by star culture, your Harmanpreet Kaurs, your Smriti Mandanas. I've always maintained that we have found such talented cricketers almost by accident and not by design. I want money to go into a system which creates more of these stars by design. The more stars you have, the more eyeballs you have, the more the market value of your team increases. And then organically, you will have a higher pay for your national team for those stars, driven by those stars. But if you rely on pure chance, and I believe it is pure chance that India have unearthed so many talented cricketers despite a huge gap in the grassroots cricket system, that you're just basically taking a pot shot in the dark. Rather than seeing equal pay today, if I was given 10 crore, I would invest 99% of it in domestic cricket, in the grassroots structure, and wait for it to then percolate up towards the national team, and then help the national team push for equal pay.
A lot of the successful collective bargaining agreements that have come in have sort of set aside this certain amount for grassroots development. The women's cricket team, the Australian women's cricket team, their deal does this. If I'm not mistaken, Kathryn, I think even your CBA does it to a certain extent. If I can go to Jayna, can this be part of any legal discussion that we have about equal pay to sort of take care of the grassroots as well? And again, does this come into the reparations issue that Anna brought up a little while ago?
Yeah, and I'm glad Snehal brought it up. I mean, while you may say that it's okay, that the players don't get paid equally, but there should be money put in the grassroots. I think both should happen. And I think the difficulties, of course, we're at a stage where, like Sharda said, we have no, even the cricket players have no contracts, or we don't have unionization which can bargain for these terms. But what we also don't have, we must understand, like the US case where they took where the soccer women's team took US Soccer Federation to court, is because they have a civil rights law which mandates equality and non-discrimination. In India, we don't have a basic civil rights law. We don't have an Equality Act or Non-Discrimination Act. And and what I think is that if we have an equality law, that would cover not only, say, equal pay, but the larger structural issues that Snehal raised and many other panelists have raised, which is, how do you ensure that promotion, everything is non-discriminatory? So if you're doing promotion for men's sports, you cannot say that you're doing unequal promotion for women's sports. It would go down to spending at school levels. How do you ensure that schools are spending equally for women's sports and men's sports? In my the school, I just want to recall a similar experience that Anna mentioned. The school that my daughter goes to is a really big international school, a lovely school, but they just don't have enough football equipment. And you find that ridiculous, but whatever limited footballs that they have, the boys take it. And the girls in this elite school don't get a chance because the sports field is occupied by the boys. And 8-year-old girls don't get the chance to even play football during their break time. So schools have to spend equally on sports for girls and boys, and it goes up all the way from the school or school level right up to the top. And we don't have structures in place to enforce this. How do we tell schools, or how do we tell district level academies that you have to spend enough for boys sports and girls sports? We don't have any structure, and unless we have some legislation that enforces non-discrimination in every aspect of engagement, it's not going to happen. So I think some of these conversations have to go up to the policy level and policymakers to say, well, we need a law, we need a civil rights law, which can then put in place measures for non-discrimination, and we can say, well, you're not spending enough on us, and we demand that there have to be equal measures taken.
Right, as a civil rights law for this, Kathryn, if I can come back to you, have there been challenges that you've faced in sort of negotiating this with people, as Jayna mentioned, taking it up to policymakers and actually bringing a lot of these changes to fruition?
For the collective bargaining agreement that we just did for both our national teams, we actually didn't have a very challenging negotiation process. I want to say that we did, but it was because we'd kind of embedded this series of principles around valuing both our male and female teams, and that no trophy should be equal more than the other. And it was all about being a leader in this space as well. And then just providing that opportunity for the women's game to flourish, but the men's game was very much behind this as well. The Socceroos and the Matildas were together through this process. So when we were able to kind of sit down at the table with the federation, we had these principles in motion, and then it was just about finding a framework where we would be able to execute that. And essentially, we just sat down and we nutted it out, and we both delivered, which was fantastic. But I think it's because we'd gone through a journey with them. We'd started with, we'd said enough's enough. The Matildas had gone on strike, and then they knew that the girls were serious about this. And also Australia fell in love with the Matildas as well. So we had the public support. And from there, it just kind of snowballed, and it was just fantastic to be a part of. So I want to say it was like, really hard fought. That last final battle wasn't. That was because we were all at the same place. But getting there, that was the tough time.
Sharda, do you think a proper law in India would help Indian sportspersons sort of enjoy the same level of comfort that Kathryn did?
I mean, a law would be great. Our country has some terrific laws. How they get about working with regard to women in the workplace, anti-harassment and discrimination. So the laws are fantastic, but how they'll work in the power structures that exist around Indian sport is very hard to tell. Because I'm not sure whether Anna or Kathryn understand this, that our sport functions in a very strange way as compared to how it does in the West, and that the power is completely invested in the governors of the sport, and that the actual athletes that play, whether they're men or they're women, their own bargaining power is very limited, and they are almost beholden to authority. But I could have a special seminar on this by myself for 3 days and talk non-stop, but I won't. And so that is what will almost be the obstacle to it. So how do you kick this in is by literally, like the LODA recommendations did talk a lot about having women representative in board meetings at this executive committee. I don't know how far we've gone there. I think it's not made any progress. In terms of Indian cricket, which is seen to many as being a sort of a ideal model of how sport should be run in India, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. So because you have all this revenue and all this money and all this that's available, and you can set benchmark standards, not just for marketing, but literally for governance, but you're not doing that because you want to keep your little power structures intact. So a law, I think it will be met with resistance. I mean, honestly, that's what I think it is, particularly a law about women. I mean, there was such a big shindig when the LODA committee said, let's have cricket played in the northeastern part of the country where it was not played before. And it was, oh God, the game is going to collapse. And so if women are going to get into it, forget it. They're not going to allow you to have that much power or that much access to to high office to be able to have these conversations. So I mean, the idea of a law is fantastic, but in India, how much it will work, I'm not really sure. It may even get supported by the court, but what it will do on the ground, where the people that run the game are involved, I'm not very optimistic at the moment.
So we're talking about the people that run the game. We have a question from Mary Benson here, who asked that whether could a strong representation in federations or the executive body of women give more of a free hand to implementing these things that we're asking for? Anna, can I come to you on this? Do you have any thoughts on how women in positions of power can implement change?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Kathryn said about, we've got to look at who's making these decisions. This week in the Telegraph, we ran an exclusive about the huge lack of underrepresentation from Black women in sports boardrooms, despite the proliferation of incredible Black female sporting figures and icons in our country and beyond. It's a big conversation here in British sport and globally at the moment at this movement of Black Lives Matter. And when it comes to gender representation, we had targets set for sports governing bodies several years ago that were supported by the government. So each sporting governing body had to reach, I think it was around 30% women on the board. The thing is, you might appoint a woman or a Black person, an Asian person onto your board, but a lone voice is not a strong voice, or it's very difficult for one person to carry this conversation. If you're around a table with, say, an entire group of white men, how do you put forward these arguments around equity and equality and really make sure that you're heard? It's very tough. We can't expect every single marginalized person, including women who are marginalized in sport, despite being 51% of the population, to carry this all the time. It's exhausting. Sometimes women just want to turn up, do their job and go home, and we're eternally giving them this extra workload. The process that Kathryn talked about to get to equal pay, I can't even begin to imagine the amount of extra hours that were put in around planning. These are unpaid hours. Women are already underpaid across society. We already have less leisure hours than men. In the UK, it's 5 less hours a week than men sitting on their asses or having a really fun time. And apparently that's got worse due to COVID. And then we're asking women to do even more. So that kind of annoys me. I've got to be honest, as a woman, I've spent many unpaid hours trying to fight for equality, co-founding Women in Football and all the work that I've done in sport. And I do it willingly, unpaid, but I don't want to put that same pressure and expectation on every single woman. I don't think that's fair. And just because you are a woman, it doesn't mean that you should solely carry the burden for change. And until we start expecting everybody around those board tables to create change, until it is part of their job and their performance, and if they're not meeting those expectations to create gender equality or ethnic equality or the various forms, then they're not meeting their performance targets, then they're not doing their job properly, and then there are consequences. Until that happens, change is going to be very slow and very exhausting for most of us, I think.
And another set of people that I don't think we've discussed as much, and this is something that's coming up in the comments, is the role of private bodies and sponsors. Jayna, there's one question addressed to you from Atul Narayan. In a state of federation organized event or tournament, an equal pay measure can maybe be enforced. But when a lot of these tournaments are mostly private tournaments, whether it's the NBA or the IPL that operate on a for-profit basis, with the remunerations negotiated on different variables, how can we compel these entities to invest in even the conversation and in equal pay?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think it kind of flows a little bit from what Sharda said, that yes, a law may be quite hard to push in India, or so that's still a long dream. But I think we can start at lower targets, which is to get at the first step push for federations to put obligations of equality in their bylaws and drafting documents. Can we push that? And in addition to federations, also leagues and sporting organizations. So when they organize a tournament or any other event, can we work together to say that let there be some basic equality measures in their bylaws or in those contracts, so that when the tournaments are kind of organized, there are some basic fair play, equal pay components that are already there. I know that I also know that sporting in India is so controlled by the coaches, the people in power, and all of that. But but let's work on getting some of these measures in. Today we are at a stage where we don't even have contracts. So at least the least we can do is push for equality and non-discrimination measures in these bylaws, and push for getting for enforcing private bodies. The question asked is that should private bodies, how do we push them? And we can certainly push private bodies to have some kind of equal pay measure. It's and I don't think just women can do it. I don't think women athletes or women teams or even women coaches can do it, but it has to be, pushed as a larger goal. And, when it's pushed as a broader kind of equality goal, it's harder for the federation or these private bodies to say, no, we won't, include it, because with what face will they say no? But at least those are initial baby steps that we can take. Can we take or are they not baby steps? Are these very big steps? I think we should just examine if we could do that.
Sharda,
sorry, if I can come in here. Just one point that Jayna mentioned is that having some basic equality pay measures is one thing to learn is models that other countries, even for example, football in Australia and cricket in Australia have implemented, is that they've separated the basic pay, which is your hourly pay rate, and kept that equal for across men and women. And then on top of that, you have components driven by marketing. For example, how much your broadcast deal is worth, which tops up your pay. And the Australian women's cricket team actually have a component which the men don't have for historical reparations, basically, acknowledging underinvestment. So delinking your basic pay and making that equal might be a first step, on top of which then, as per the value of your women's national team, you can have marketing bonuses, etc.
Yeah, if I can just jump in here for a second, I agree with what Snehal said. I remember I've read your fantastic report that Karunya and Snehal, both of you have put together. I think Jayna has said a very important thing, is that at least push at that level for with your sports bodies to negotiate with broadcasters to start with. If you're going to have this massive broadcasting contract, it has to include having women's matches live. It sounds like, I'm sure Anna and Kathryn are saying, but isn't this obvious? But it's in India, we need to push this at the start to say, yeah, you have to have those games show. And we've seen more women's matches that are live on TV, and you've seen that there's public interest in it. If the Indian women's cricket team has done well, they have people watching them. So it's not that they're not, but you have to get broadcasters to commit to covering these games and covering these games with the same quality and the attention that they give to the men's games. That's at least the basic starting point. If the sports bodies put it forward and say that no, this is what it is, this is how we are going to engage with you, then you make progress. If the sports organizations don't do it themselves, then you need to sort of bring down, I don't know, I'm speechless at the idea to what you'll do if that's what they don't want.
Yeah, but I think if we could push, sporting bodies, broadcasters, event, basically everyone involved in these, in every part of it, at least to insert some basic equality measures in their base contracts or documents. I don't know. So I mean, we have to start doing it at some place.
Anna, we have a question here about how media coverage can play a role in this. Is that something you can take up?
Sure. First of all, Sharda, I wish that Kathryn and I were sat there thinking, of course you've got to get broadcasting. We don't have it here. It's it's just so depressing. We've been in lockdown since March. Men's football's back. It's on the TV. Women's football's not on the TV, and it isn't usually anyway. So at the moment, women's football is invisible again, as is most of women's sports. So yeah, very frustrating. And you're absolutely right that you've got to be able to see it. I think there's just Yes, media coverage plays a massive part. There's kind of this triangle of media coverage, sponsorship and finance, and then attendance and grassroots having an impact, and they all feed into each other. So when sponsors get involved and excited, as we've seen with women's football here, Barclays put in this incredible sponsorship deal. We'd never seen anything like it, of £10 million for women's football. It just shook up the whole eco-structure, and people started really sitting up and taking notice, like, wow, 10 million, are you sure? Like, you could have got it cheaper than that. Why did you pay that much? And it was so cool that Barclays came back and said, yeah, but if we want to really make this league fly, and if we want to impact grassroots, then we have to put in more money. So yeah, there was a rugby sponsor, Tyrrell's, that recently declined to renew their women's rugby deal. And on the sports desk, we were having this conversation. Oh, this is terrible. Like, what are women's rugby going to do now? And women's rugby voices came out and said, "Oh, thank God they've gone, because they only put in a 4-figure sum in the first place anyway. We better get a better sponsor." So yeah, the sponsorship part is huge, and it does impact on how then media and others see the value of women's sport. But the media also have to play their own role and can't just look to sponsorship to decide whether it's of any intrinsic value or not. And I get very frustrated about the continued kind of troll argument of, well, why would we put women's football on the TV, or why would you cover it when it's of lesser value, of lesser interest? And you've only got to look at economics to see that women's sport is less valuable. And people use this argument of economics as though it's a kind of a pure science that simply inarguable fact that exists in its own little vacuum. And the only reasons that compel you to invest in women's sport are kind of moral, and therefore the interpretation of that is that they're a bit soft and a bit wishy-washy and probably quite female. There's only these moral imperatives to invest in women's sport, and that's so frustrating. There are moral imperatives, but there are also economic imperatives. And Lewis FC, whose shirt I'm wearing today, puts across this brilliant argument using an economic model, which was when Coca-Cola decided to launch Diet Coke. At the time, Diet Coke didn't exist. Coca-Cola had saturated the market, and they wanted to find a new way to make more money. So they invented this product called Diet Coke. To make it successful, they had to invest a lot of money in it. They had to market it well and market it globally. But ultimately, Diet Coke is now a brand that outsells Coke, has reached a whole new audience, and specifically female audience, and is incredibly successful business tale. The same model can be applied to women's sport. And that's a long roundabout way of saying, of course, media should cover women's sport, but we have to understand that we have to value it and see its potential. And it's not just this kind of charity case where we all have to be grateful or it's the right thing to do.
I think.
Can I just jump in on top of Anna? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
Conversation, because I think it's a great one, but it's exactly that. It's the investment and the value. You can't value women's sport if you can't see it. And a lot of the big TV rights, especially FIFA at the moment, for a long time, the Women's World Cup has just been bundled in as an adjunct to the sponsors that they already have, the broadcast dollars that are already there. So this whole economic model falls, like this argument falls down, because there's been no opportunity to value women's sport because it hasn't been able to stand on its own 2 feet. And I think the investment is critical. That's what it needs to be viewed as. This is an investment. This is long-term. This is social. This is, pushing this agenda out, and it will bear fruit because, I just totally agree with what you're saying, Anna. Couldn't say it any better than what you just have.
Robin has a question that sort of builds on this, I think, and maybe I'll let Snehal take this. Is a feasible solution then to sort of de-link it everything, keep aside the moral responsibility of doing this, the economic value of doing this, and just saying, okay, there's this revenue basket that is there, and irrespective, and the distribution and payouts can be done on the basis of various levels of whether it's international, domestic, etc., that an athlete is playing, without any of these considerations.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Is there a value to have an overall revenue basket and then distribute it based on which level an athlete plays?
Absolutely. And I think that is a model that a lot of other countries follow. I think collective bargaining agreements for Australian football and Australian cricket say that a certain percentage of revenue will go to your both national teams, and then a certain percentage of revenue will go to grassroots cricket. But that demands a high level of transparency, something that Indian sports organizations aren't really known for. For example, even when it comes to fixing these men's contracts, which are these huge numbers for cricket, 7 crore, etc., they are slightly arbitrary. And for a long time, those numbers didn't increase either. And the men's cricketers, despite being the best in the world and being some great products themselves, didn't have the bargaining power to ask for an increase in those contracts. So it will demand a very holistic, it will take a very holistic change for that model to come into India, starting with transparency on what happens to the money that comes in. And that is probably another conversation, like Sharda said, that she can go on for 3 days. I see her grinning away.
We have another question here from Brett Oster, directed to Kathryn, I think. We've seen conditions for women athletes differing from their male counterparts beyond pay in terms of airline travel, quality of accommodation. Do you see this gap closing, or is there still a long way to go? And does Kathryn want to take this?
Yeah, sure. Well, in relation to the Australian women's team with the Matildas, that was a very live part of this whole deal. And it wasn't just about the remuneration, it was the high performance standards that come with it, which is exactly that, the travel, the accommodation, the staff that are surrounding the team as well. So for us, I think that's an easy one. That's even more easier than remuneration. And there's no argument to that. And that is where the US women's case was torn apart in courts, in the fact that the men can justify flying business class and the women can't. So for those things, they came fairly easy to us. So yeah, I see no difference in not affording that to female athletes.
I think we have time for one last question. We have, again, an international player among the comments. I think this is from Shikha Pandey, who I presume is the same Shikha Pandey who is a cricketer, an Indian women's cricketer who played the final at the MCG. So she points out that Cricket Australia announced that it was going to match the prize money for the women and the men, even though the prize money offered by the ICC was not the same. Cricket Australia said that they'd make up that difference. This was just about the prize money alone. But so is this a good place to start? And if I could just have closing remarks from panelists about this, is this a good way to start, or should we have bigger ambitions? Does Kathryn want to take this?
Yeah, look, this is a very, very live argument, and this is probably the one within our whole agreement, the one factor that we couldn't change internally. Because if you look at the men's and the women's World Cup, the pay difference in terms of prize money is astronomical. The men, it's incredible to think that they pay the men that much. And we've been lobbying FIFA to ask why. Why does there need to be such a difference? So I think that if you can try to balance that, that's a massive win if we can get that across the line.
All right, and Sharda, to Chava, how can we keep this conversation going? I mean, is this a good start? How can we keep this conversation going?
Yeah, I mean, if sort of starting with equal pay, to me that is what the Australian, what Cricket Australia did was fantastic, because it was a great gesture and it made news. The BCCI should, I assume that when the time comes, they will see that, listen, they've got to compete with the Aussies on this. But I think there's also a lot of real work around women's cricket that has to be done at the bottom, which is it's not very glamorous. It's not newsworthy in that sense, but it's got to be done. Because if you don't do it, you will be left with this vacuum, which between the absolutely elite athletes and the athletes at the most basic level. And coming back to what I think Snehal just mentioned about the fact that for a long time, the Indian that this contract system that works, I don't think it really works on the percentage share of broadcast revenues. They say it does. There's some 26-13 figure that you get, But if you're looking at the numbers, a lot of the first-class domestic men's cricketers tell you, listen, I've been making the same approximately vaguely for the last 15 years. The same amount of money, and your broadcast rights have gone up many times over. So these are all the sort of small things I think that need to be looked at as importantly as the big sort of grand gesture.
We have a comment from Tushar, which I think sums up our whole discussion today and might be a good place to end at, where he says that there definitely needs to be a shift in the dialogue of equal pay in sports, and that the conversation is about a structural women-centric reforms rather than just remuneration. And I think this is what our panels have helped us arrive at. So thank you everyone for being a part of this. And I'll hand it over to Shan.
Thank you to the panel for that engaging and insightful discussion.